그 단셀리우스 교수님하고 그 시간은 전체 강의 후에도 하실 수 있습니다. 그러니까 지금 2분 후에 강연회를 다시 시작해야 되는 관계로 시간을 좀 준수해 주시길 바라겠습니다. 자, 밖에 계신 분들 자리에 착석해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 이제 두 번째 강연 곧 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저 밖에 우리 학교 관계에 되시는 분들은 외부에 계신 분들 다 들어오실 수 있도록 안내를 부탁드립니다. 곧 두 번째 강의 시작하겠습니다. 잠깐만 좀 더 기다려 보도록 하겠습니다. 지금 밖에 외부에 많이들 나가 계셔서 들어오실 때까지 잠깐 좀 기다리도록 하겠습니다. 예, 다 들어오시면 좀 예. 이제 두 번째 강의 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Let's begin with our second lecture. It's my honor and privilege to present the Korean Church, Dr. Campbell. Please. Dr. Campbell 교수님은, Ted Campbell 교수님은 현재 감리대학으로 우리에게는 알려져 있습니다. 그 남감리대학교에서 Church Historian 교회사 교수이시면서 웨슬리안 스터디 또 경건주의 쪽을 가르치시는 교수님이십니다. 이 찰스 웨슬리 소사이티의 프레지던트도 역임을 하셨고 어제 대화하는 중에 알았습니다마는 이화 재단의 외국인으로서의 그 이사 경력까지 있으셔서 한국 대학교, 특히 한국 기독교 대학들이 가지고 있는 현 상황에 대해서도 이해도가 굉장히 깊은 분이셨습니다. 게레 신학교, 시카고 위쪽에 위치하고 있는 게레 신학교에서 총장직도 수행하셨고, 제가 아는 바로는 한국에 아직 그 교수님의 저서들이 활발하게 번역된 것들은 많지 않은 것 같습니다만은 많은 저서, 특별히 Methodist Doctrine, The Essentials, 매우 유명한 저서일 뿐더러 존 웨슬리에 관한 다수의 저서들이 있는 전 세계적으로 유명한 웨슬리 학자십니다. 여러분들께 소개하는데 오늘 강의의 제목은 Theological Formation in the Age of ChatGPT, One Day in the Life of John Wesley and Its Implications라는 제목으로 강의를 진행하실 것입니다. 강의가 진행된 후에는 이전과 같은 포맷으로 여러분들 질문을 받도록 할 텐데, 질문을 쓰셔서 손을 드시면 저희 학교 관계된 분들이 질문지를 수합하도록 하겠습니다. 그런 형식으로 진행할 것이고, 한 가지 광고를 드리면 오늘 모든 일정이 끝난 뒤에 촬영도 자유롭게 하실 수 있고, 이후에 신석구 목사 기념관 지하 2층에 간단한 다과가 준비되어 있습니다. 완전한 식사는 아니고 간단한 요깃거리를 학교 차원에서 준비를 했습니다. 많이 참석하셔서 이어지는 대화가 계속될 수 있도록 함께 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. 이제 테드 캠벨 교수님과 남기정 교수님 논찬자로서 발표해 주실 때 여러분들 박수로 맞이하도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much. I am simply delighted to be here at the Methodist Theological University in Seoul. I visited here before. I spoke in the chapel here last Tuesday, but I'm simply delighted to be invited to give this part of the presidential lectures here. Thank you, 감사합니다, to my friend Lee Jung and to all of the staff and faculty here, and especially to Professor Nam, who is going to respond to this paper. Yes, I want to speak on the subject of theological formation in the age of ChatGPT, one day in the life of John Wesley and its implications. Yes, ChatGPT. You can ask ChatGPT or other AI-based programs to write you a nice theological paper on atonement theory in Charles Wesley's hymns, and it will sometimes spit out a credible paper on the subject. But remember that a professor or a board of ordained ministry can also submit a student's paper to ChatGPT and ask it if the paper was in fact written by ChatGPT. I am not anti-artificial intelligence. In fact, I'm a big advocate of technology. Bring it on. So to give you one example about what I like about technology, AI imaging can take a really dull photo and make me look skinny, and I really like that. It can make me look, come to the next one, make me look distinguished. It can move on. It can make me look culturally sophisticated. It can make me look like a star. It can make me look weird. And it can make me look like an astronaut, which is what I always wanted to be until God called me to other heavenly things. The problem is, of course, is that None of that is, if we could have the next slide. Yeah, none of that is true. That's actually me, and it's all fake. So that's one of the problems, is figuring out the fake from the real. And in fact, I think that's the issue here. ChatGPT does not shape us as people, right? It's just a way to get at information. But it doesn't make you any different. It just demonstrates that you know how to ask a question. Classical forms of spiritual formation do change you. They change us. They form us as people. And that's one of the challenges then that we face now. So if we could move to the next slide, which should show John Wesley mounted on a horse. There we are, John Wesley in front of the chapel in Bristol. John Wesley has been depicted as a man of action, moving around, doing this, preaching the gospel, being attacked by mobs and so forth, traveling to Ireland and Scotland and other places, defending himself before newspapers and magazines, advocating for the poor, empowering women to act as exhorters and then preachers, calling for the abolition of the slave trade. In fact, that's very much the way John Wesley depicted himself. In his serialized publication, The Journal of the Reverend John Wesley, A.M., published from 1740. What you have to remember is that there's two very different things. There is John Wesley's diary, which is a very, very personal thing, never intended for publication. And then there is his published journal, in which he's basically a blogger. He's basically giving you an account of his life after he's thought about it for 3 or 4 or 5 years. This is a thought-through document. So I want to show you how he's working on making there's a page from the journal, and it's written in a kind of hybrid shorthand. That's 6 February 1736, which was my wife's birthday, but she doesn't remember that. And it's recounting when he arrived in Georgia, actually, where Don is now. And I want to show you how the journal starts. So if we could get the next slide up. The next slide is going to say it's a very carefully written, published work using contemporary media and focusing on contemporary incidents. Move to the next slide, because it should be the quotation of the first sentences. Yes, here's the first sentence of John Wesley's published journal. Dear Sir, on Sunday last, I was informed that my brother and I had killed your son. Now you got to admit, that's interesting. That's snappy. It gets your attention. And if you want to know what's going on, I'm not going to tell you. You have to go read about it in the journal. But it illustrates how he composed the journal. The diary is boring. I got up at 6 a.m. I put my clothes on. I said my prayers. I had religious conversation. He writes all that stuff off, and then in the journal, he writes the exciting stuff. The mobs attacking, going out to preach in new areas, and so on and so forth. But other sources, like the diary and his personal letters, give us a very different picture of John Wesley's daily activities. And they suggest that there was a side of his personality not as well known as the activities that are better known from his journal. Most biographies of John Wesley have simply taken his journal as the basis, but they didn't look at his letters, they didn't look at his private diary, and they paint a different picture of him. So this lecture is going to start out by examining one day in the life of John Wesley. It's Monday, the 2nd of April, 1739. As we will see, this is a crucial day in his life and his experience. And I'm going to look at his letters, his diary, his accounts from other witnesses, and his published journal by looking at all of them simultaneously. This is the day when John Wesley did something very new. the way he represents it, I think, is tricky. He says, I preached outside in the open air. I'm convinced that's not the issue. There was no restriction against anyone preaching in the open air. He just wants to be able to say, and that's what Jesus did, and I'm just like Jesus, and everybody's persecuting me because I'm like Jesus, see? But there's more to it than that, and we're going to see about this. Now, I want to summarize a little about the previous days. He had been in London, if we could move forward, between 29th of March through Sunday, April 1st. He was traveling by horse from London to Bristol. So what he did was he got on Google Maps and tracked out his progress from the Foundry in London all the way over to Bristol, spent 2 nights on the road. Actually, I'm sure that in his time, Google Maps had a little horse logo, so you could say, what was the best route to take by horse? But they don't have that anymore, unfortunately. He moves around. He's in contact with Moravian Christians, but it's a very weird time for Moravian Christians in England. And one of the problems in Methodist history is that we have represented these weird English Moravians as being what all Moravians of all times have ever stood for. And they're not. They're very eccentric. As a matter of fact, within a decade or so, the Moravian Church will disavow what's going on with these London Moravians. But right now, he's in touch with them. On Sunday, April 1st, he witnessed George Whitefield speaking in public. Now, this may be right. He's there at George Whitefield's sister's house where he was staying. And this is what he says in his journal, which he wrote several years later. He says, I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he set me on an example on Sunday. Having been all my life till very lately so tenacious of every point regarding decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. Well, that's kind of interesting, but as again, he's trying to make the issue preaching out of doors, and I'm going to say I don't think that's what the issue really was. In fact, if we could move on to the next slide or so, let's see what goes next. Yes, an early Bristol Methodist gave his own testimony, and he says that later that day, April 1st, which is April Fool's Day in the United States, but you don't celebrate that here, do you? Okay, neither in England. Okay, he says, I went to hear that worthy minister of Jesus Christ, the Reverend George Whitefield, at a room in Baldwin Street, where I made sport in company with others too much like myself while hearing the sermon. When it was ended, Mr. Whitefield said there was one coming after him, the latchet of whose shoes he was unworthy to loose, the Reverend John Wesley, who was to preach in the Brickyard at the farther end of St. Philip's Plain on the following day. So Whitefield is setting up John Wesley. John Wesley is staying in the house with Whitefield's sister and Whitefield himself. They're sort of talking closely together. John Wesley is making his plans to step out and do something new. Now, why was he upset by seeing Whitefield's outdoor preaching? I'm going to suggest a couple of things, so bring up the next bullet point there. I'm convinced it's really not about preaching outdoors. So far as we know, there was no rule against a parish priest preaching out of doors. Some of the parish ceremonies every year, like what they call beating the bounds of the parish, were performed outdoors, so that was not really problematic. But there were problematic points. So in the next bullet point, and take the sub-point under that as well, move on to that, is lack of church authorization, and very specifically, something that John Wesley knew. The very first of the early Christian councils, the Council of Nicaea in 325, forbade clergy from operating within the jurisdiction of other bishops, right? They're trying to put a lid on this thing, but that was the rule, in fact, in the Church of England. What we call the Anglican canons, the church law of the Church of England, stated that preaching was only allowed in a parish by clergy who had been licensed, given permission to preach there. And so I would say what this would be like would be, if you want to see how offensive this would be, I'll give you a test. Some Sunday morning, go to Kwang Lim Methodist Church in Gangnam and just say to the pastor there, sorry, but God has called me to preach here this morning. You're going to have to just sit on the side and I'm going to take over and preach. What do you think about that? They're not going to be very happy about it. My guess is they're not going to be very happy about that. So this, I think, is what's really going on, is that he is at the point of violating the law of his church. Now, as Don knows, this has become a big issue in the United Methodist Church. Do we violate the rules of our church? Don and I both stood at the altar of God, and we made promises that we would keep the doctrine, the liturgy, the order and discipline of the United Methodist Church. So it's not just violating the order of the church. We'd be violating our own promises that we had made if we had done that. Now, John Wesley has his way of getting around that, but I think that's the big issue here. He's preaching without authorization. So, even more importantly, I think there may have been one more bullet point, yes. In 1689, there was a settlement of religion in England, enormously important for British history. It's the first time Britain, the country of England at that point, and then Scotland later, the first time they're going to allow anyone to have public worship that's not Anglican, that's not part of the Church of England. But it said that if you're preaching in England or conducting any worship services, you either have to be in an Anglican church or chapel or in a licensed dissenting place of worship. That is to say, a licensed Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Baptist, or Quaker chapel that had been licensed. When John Wesley or George Whitefield steps outside to preach, they're simply invading the parish of another minister, and they are not authorized to do that. In fact, within 6 days, the Bishop of Bristol writes to John Wesley and says, "Sir, you are in contravention of the Act of Toleration." That's the big deal going on here. But John Wesley had been working on this for a long time. And he notes in his diary and his journal that on that evening, April 1st, he starts expounding Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And he says he thought it was, quote, one pretty remarkable precedent for field preaching. Again, he's sort of sidestepping the issue of church law and just saying this justifies preaching out of doors. At 11 p.m. in the evening, he presided at the Lord's Supper for about 30 people in the home of a Mr. Deschamps. That itself was a violation of the law of the Church of England that did not allow conducting the Lord's Supper in a private home. He didn't get to bed until 1 a.m. Usually he went to bed a lot earlier than that. But what's he going to do the next day? He's already been put up to it by George Whitefield. What's he going to do? So let's look at the events of April the 2nd. This is the day I want to track out. And I want you to be thinking about, how do we form people as theologians today? How do we form people as pastors who are going to be capable of doing what he's going to do on this day? Some of this is going to be really exciting, and some of this is really boring. But that's my point, actually, is that some of the boring stuff is some of the really important stuff. His private diary and his letters tell a great deal more about this. His journal only mentioned his outdoor preaching, but his diary for Monday, April 2nd, and if we could move to the next slide, I think, yes, you will see that. Monday, April 2nd, 7 a.m., sang Necessary Talk Religious, 8:45 at Mrs. Such and Such's house, tea, religious talk, sang, prayed. 10 a.m. at home, George Whitefield read letters. 12 noon, dinner, prayed. At 1 o'clock, George Whitefield went sang, necessary talk, religious. See how boring this is? It's just a little list that you make up of what you did during the day. 2 o'clock, meditated, writ diary. 2:30, writ to the brethren. That takes an hour and a half to write this long letter to the Moravian brethren. 4, at the glass house, 3 or 4,000. That's all he says in his diary about this big event of preaching outdoors. 6 o'clock, at Mrs. Norman's, tea, religious talk, sang. 7 o'clock, back at the Baldwin Street Society, sang, etc. 9:15, at home. He means he's back home with George Whitefield's sister, and he says, easy there. I love that. That's really, you feel after this long day doing something really new, he's got to kind of relax and chill a little bit. So here's what's going on through that day, and we can move through this pretty quickly. 7 a.m., he got up. Now, he usually gets up at 5 o'clock a.m., so if you say, why is he getting up so late? Well, it's because he was up so late the night before. He was celebrating communion at 11 p.m., and he didn't get to bed until 1 a.m., so which is about what I did last night. So, you know, he sleeps in a little bit. He sleeps until 7 o'clock. The day begins with singing and necessary talk. He apparently sang by himself. As well as with others. So you can imagine he's in his song in his room and others are hearing him. I guess Mrs. Greville, that's Whitefield's sister, is hearing him singing in his room. Hope he's not too loud and so forth. But that's his consistent practice. He says, necessary talk, religious. He notes whether he talks with someone, is it necessary talk or trifling talk? And is it religious or is it on some other subject? He's trying to hold himself to only serious religious talk. John Wesley is not the person you want to invite to your party, right? Nor is John Calvin, for that matter. Avoid the Johns. Martin Luther would be a lot of fun. You referred to Luther. Francis of Assisi would be a scream. He would be a lot of fun to be around. John Wesley, he's working on being serious all the time. 8:45 a.m., he went out to have tea with an unnamed woman, and again noted religious talk as well as singing and praying, presumably with her in this case. She's not identified, but we think she's a Mrs. Norman with whom he's going to have tea later in the day. 3 women, including Mrs. Greville, Mrs. Norman, and a Mrs. Panu, are going to be the first 3 members of the women's band in Bristol. And it looks like he's having little conversations, individual conversations with each of them to begin setting up that part of his ministry. Move to 10 a.m., he's back at home, at Mrs. Greville's home, and he speaks again to George Whitefield. He also read letters, though in the compressed style of his diary, it's not clear if this is by himself or with Whitefield. Then move to the next slide. At noon, he has dinner with Whitefield and his sister, Mrs. Greville. That's what we would call lunch. Don knows that even in the United States in our lifetime, the designations for the various meals at different times of the day have sort of moved around. After prayer, Whitefield leaves. He's actually on his way to America to go back to the ministry in Georgia that John Wesley had started. So he's on his own from this point. 2 p.m. Now he's getting ready. He's 2 hours away from sort of T-2 and counting. He's gonna do this big thing he's worried about. He meditated, it says, and he writ diary. Diary keeping takes some of his time every day, but this is not the journal. This is just the diary where he's filling in the day's happenings. And then he's writing letters, and he spends an hour and a half writing to the brethren. But this letter to the brethren is actually a long letter. You can move on there to 2:30. And it's a letter to the Moravian Society in London, where he describes George Whitefield's preaching. So this is what's uttermost top of his mind, is George Whitefield's outdoor and frankly illegal preaching. The body of the letter indicates this is what he's thinking about. He's going to follow Whitefield's example of preaching outdoors unauthorized. He says, "Pray ye, my dear brethren, that some portion of Whitfield's spirit may be given to your poor, weak brother, John Wesley." That's his concluding thing. Don, as a liturgiologist, you might be interested that he adds a P.S. saying, "I left my cassock and gown in London. Would somebody please forward that to me?" That's what he always wore. So his letter to Hutton and the Moravian Brethren gives this kind of summary. He's going over in his mind what he's thinking about. He's getting ready to do this big thing. Now, at 4 p.m., he's going to do it. The diary only mentions at the Glass House 3,000 or 4,000, but his published journal gives this very famous account of what he did. So it says, yes, Monday the 2nd at 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile. That's a very famous phrase in Methodist history. He submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence, that means a little rise in the ground adjoining the city, to about 3,000 people. Now, one thing you need to know is that it's been definitively proven that John Wesley's estimates of the size of crowds are what we call pastoral estimates of a congregation. What that really means is exaggerated. We know that because there's a place in Cornwall called Gwinnett Pit. It's a mining pit. And John Wesley said, again, that he preached to about 3,000 people there. Well, so the Methodists 20 or 30 years ago decided, let's see how many human bodies we can actually cram into this place. And they could get about 400 people in there, but that was all. So you can tell that that's an exaggeration. But he does something at the Glass House at this point. He says, he preached to about 3,000 people. The scripture on which I spoke was this: is it possible anyone should be ignorant? It is fulfilled in every true minister of Christ. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable day of the Lord. So move to the next slide, and you can see my map. I've been trying to map out actually where this was. We know the part of Bristol where this occurred, and I was there last summer and went wandering around taking some pictures and so forth. But it is just somewhere in the general area of what they call the Temple Bridge in Bristol, which is one of the larger north-south ways going into the city there. Some dispute about the location, but let's move on. Near this site right here in Bristol, there is a plaque, and the plaque is shown on the left that says this is roughly the location of where his first outdoor preaching occurred. So John Wesley, as I say, the crowd is a little exaggerated there, but maybe a few hundred people are there in this area of Bristol. It's near the port, and it's near where they had the glass docks. It's where they're shipping glass in and out of Britain at that point. So next slide, if we could see it. This is a cartoon book in the United States. It's Wesley Brothers Comics. And this guy who does it, he's very popular among United Methodists, but the title of the book is Submitting to Be More Vile. And you can see how he depicts John and Charles. John is dressed up with a white shirt and a proper thin black tie, and has a kitty cat on the side and is sort of stroking the cat. Charles has got his headset on and his guitar, he's sort of rocking and rolling and so forth. So it's interesting that Wesley wanted to preach the good news to the poor. I would add a little critical midrash on this, a little comment that the story that John Wesley doesn't tell the whole story in the gospel. The story is that the leader of the synagogue delivered the scroll to Jesus, right? And Jesus preaches then. Now, see, I think what that means is that Don, you and I could have a conversation about this, but I think that means that the congregation has authorized Jesus to preach. They are handing the scroll to him to give him the authorization to speak. So it's ironic that he's using this text for his first unauthorized preaching. So I think that's interesting. He wrote a letter. I'm going to go look back. In 1734, he wrote a letter that said he could not envision fulfilling God's intentions for him either by serving as a parish priest or by serving as a priest in a university. He wanted a wider field of work. And he appends that letter right here in his journal as if a way of saying, I've finally got to this point. I've finally said, I cannot just function like any other priest. I've got a special calling, right? And on this day, 2nd of April, 1739, he's found that calling. His calling is to be an itinerant evangelist. And what that practically means for him is he's going to get no support from the church. No bishop is going to appoint him as the rector in a parish, and where he would have a guaranteed income and so forth. He is going to have to make his own living as an evangelist from this point. All right, now, big event. But 6 p.m., he had tea with Mrs. Norman, and I think it's lovely that he says, easy there. All right. Do you make in Korean culture a distinction between introverts and extroverts? Introverted people and extroverted people? Yeah. What are the terms? Maybe you could say.
내성적, 외향적.
Yeah.
성격.
All right. John Wesley is almost always depicted as an extrovert. He's out there, he's doing things, because you can see that's what's consistently in the journal that he himself wrote. He gave that impression. But if you look at this in the context of this whole day, it looks like, one of the things they say about introverted people, and I'm slightly on the introverted side myself, is that after you speak to a big group of people, not that I'd point to any particular big group of people I'm speaking to, but I'm going to be tired after this, right? An introverted person's going to, okay, you need to be easy there. And I think that's what John Wesley is kind of signaling. 7 p.m., he met with the Baldwin Street Society, the other Methodist society in Bristol from where Whitefield had spoken the previous evening. And then at 9:45, after an hour and 45 minutes there at the Baldwin Street Society, he returned to Mrs. Greville's home. He had a meal, said he was, he's easy there, actually. He's easy there at home. I suspect he was easy at both of those places. A relief. And he went to bed at 10:45, so he actually got to bed 15 minutes earlier than he had the night before. But he's doing all this cool, interesting stuff. Now, if I weigh this day together, this one day in his journal, and let's see, pull up the first bullet point, or the first, yeah. He spends 4 hours, I calculate, in larger groups of people where he's doing something like preaching out of doors and so forth. Second thing, he spends 4 hours at least with intimate groups, that is to say, with groups of just 2 people or 3 people. I think that's very interesting. Third point, add it all together, he spends 9 hours by himself during this day. Now, a question that you could ask is this normative? He was awake for 17 hours on that day. Less than 4 of these were in larger groups. 23% of the day, 4 or 5 hours private conversations. 25% of the day, 26% of the day. The remaining 9 hours were spent by himself alone. That's about half of the day that he spent by himself, studying, meditating, praying, writing letters, writing up his diary, writing up his journal, and so forth. Was this a representative day? I suspect that it actually was not. In fact, as I look at his diaries, not his journal, but his diaries, what I find is that I think most days are actually, he even spent more time by himself, right then on this day. So you can see a couple of diary entries. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. Here is January 3rd, 1741, but he's writing, he's studying Matthew 7, he's writing for the society. He goes to someone's house, dinner and religious talk. He goes to the school. He goes to a band, and then the bands. Okay, so he's doing things with groups there. At Sister England's with Brother Humphrey there, and at Mrs. Deschamps. But he's doing, this is in an intimate group of people where he has tea. Revelation 14:13. Later in his diary, he'll just write out one verse of Scripture. Bam! That's what he's been thinking about that hour. And then Sister Davis and Ann Cole were buried. So he performs a funeral, 10:30, he's at home. Now, the terrible thing about the diaries is we're missing 40 years of them. 40 years of John Wesley's diaries have simply disappeared. They were probably burned after he died. There is an account of somebody just taking out all this old junk and burning it, so we can't fill in the notes. But as soon as we get back, let's move to the next slide that should show December the 1st in the year, I'm not sure what year that is. So here's 1781. Very similar pattern. Go again, 1791. Let's go 10 years later to the next slide. 1791, it's Wednesday, February the 23rd. 4:45 a.m. he prayed, necessary business. He read, prayed at 6:30. He had tea and religious talk. 7, in the chase, that means a covered carriage. He read Gustavus Vasa, an account by an African man of his enslavement, and John Wesley had actually paid to support the printing of this book so people could see how terrible enslavement was. This man had become a Christian. 9 o'clock, he's with James Rogers. 10:30, he's at Mr. Belson's. Dinner, religious talk, prayer. 4:30, at Mr. Telford's, tea, religious talk. He doesn't do anything outside the house this day, and I'll show you why in a minute. 8 o'clock, he has supper and religious talk. At 9:30, he prays, and that's it. That is the last entry in John Wesley's diary. He wrote his famous last letter to William Wilberforce on the next day, and he died 7 days later on 2nd of March, 1791. He kept up that strenuous discipline of study and reading and writing and prayer and quiet, intimate conversations right up to the very end of his life. So what do we say about this with respect to implications for theological formation, especially in an age of ChatGPT? Could John Wesley's practices of journaling and other aspects of his little-known quiet life serve as a precedent for Christian practice today? What implications does it have for Ihu Jung and me and Don and others who are in the field of theological formation? Well, I have 3 suggestions. Now, the first thing I want to say, this is kind of like when you stick in a fourth, but you say 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So the 0 is to say, I'm not dismissing what we've been doing in the past. You need to learn the culture, the history of the New Testament. You need to be deeply formed in the Scriptures. Think about John Wesley being formed at his home in Epworth, where they are reading the book of prayer, order for morning prayer every morning. They are reading the order for evening prayer every evening. They're studying at least a chapter of the Bible every day. Day after day, after week, after week, after month, after year after year. They're imbued with the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. They learn this Christian culture very, very deeply. And that has to be part of our formation as Christians. I'm not saying we don't need to think critically. We do. We absolutely need to think in new critical ways and look at who's being dispossessed by our churches and the critical issues you have raised already here. But 3 things I think we might think about. Number 1, how do we cultivate the life of the mind and the spirit with daily prayer and study? It's just that's where he spends most of his time. Saying, what do you have to do to be a great religious revivalist? Go out there and preach revivals. Well, actually, I would say spend 9 hours a day in study formation, and that's what's likely to give you the result that you see with John Wesley's ministry. They reveal that his busy activities in larger groups were typically preceded by much less spectacular, quiet activities, meditation, prayer, reading, writing, conversation. How are we going to do that in theological schools? The general minutes of the early Methodist societies said to the lay preachers who also had other jobs, steadily spend all the morning in study, or at least 5 hours in every 4 and 20. And if they object, but I have no taste for reading, here's how the minutes respond, and probably it's John Wesley himself. It says, contract a taste for reading by use, by doing it, or return to your trade. Go back home, okay? You don't need to be a preacher if you don't do this. So this is not a hypothetical recommendation. John Wesley did this. And I think part of accountability in groups and theological schools ought to be asking each other, how much time do you spend every day in study? When I was a PhD program, the one thing that got me through was my wife, who was not kind to me about this. She said just about every day, how many pages did you write today? Okay. You know, and then she'd say, you know, we came here because you wanted to do this PhD, not me. This is your choice. So you need, she's holding me accountable to that, and I finished it, okay? So there's something to be said for that. We need to hold each other accountable for that life of the mind, life of the reading, and so on and so forth, that life of the Spirit. If you want to bring about a spiritual revolution, spend hours every day in study, writing, meditation, prayer, and discussion in small groups. And we want to form students in that kind of discipline. We've tried several different ways of doing it at Perkins. We've never really settled on one particular pattern, so I'd be interested in hearing how other places do that. Number 2, in the way of suggestions, a practice of reflective journaling in spiritual formation. I've explained to you the difference between John Wesley's diary and John Wesley's journal. I think we should do that. Now, one of my students is here today, and that's Cho Yun-bul. I'm not going to ask her to reveal herself, but she's right there. Yun-bul was with me. So she has traveled to the United States, but then she traveled with me to England, and I asked all the students to keep a reflective journal every day. Next time I do it, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to ask them to keep the diary of what they're seeing every day, and then 3 days later or 2 weeks later after the trip, go back and reread that and ask, what was God saying to me there? What is God asking me to do through this experience that I've had? So a practice of reflective journaling. Move to the next slide. Just as a way of saying, John Wesley was a blogger. And yes, that's an AI-produced image. I wrote into the AI field, give me a picture of John Wesley with a laptop computer, and bam, that's what I got. I love it. Cool. It is a little anachronistic. I admit it as a historian. It just makes the point. What bloggers do today is what John Wesley was doing, not in his diary, but in his journal. He's producing, that's produced for a reading public, and you have to write it like a writer writes for a reading public. You need to think about that. So both a diary and a journal, I think that's the critical thing. And then I'll move forward to the third point, which is maybe the most controversial. But what about oral examinations as an alternative to not just ChatGPT, but whatever? See, think about this. Where you're going to use your theological education in a parish is like, let me give you 2 examples. You're standing at the back of the church. You gave a great sermon. Somebody comes back and says, great sermon, great sermon, great sermon. And then somebody says, Pastor, my sister died yesterday. Why would God do that? And the pastor says, oh, let me go to ChatGPT and see what it says about your sister dying. No, you don't. You've got to have that in you, right? By that point when you go out to speak. So an oral exam means you sit down at a table with no cell phone and no computer, and the examiners have no cell phones, and they ask you questions. This is actually part of Oxford University's process. I never had to go through it because I never had a disputed grade, but all sorts of stories about one prime minister who, when he was at Oxford, was a terrible student and and terrible students make presidents of the United States and so on and so forth. George W. Bush spoke at SMU and said, if you made a C today at this graduation, then you too can be the president of the United States. But he did that at Yale, Don, as you know, so there you go. But, the question is, what can you say right there on the spot? And I'm sort of proposing here, at least in Dallas, that we ought to try that now, because I think it's just gone too far with getting AI or some other service to write a paper for you. I just think we've gone too far down that line. Now, I'll admit, I'm getting toward the end of my career. I'm a little tired of grading written exams. I feel like I'm not very good at it anymore, but when people say, what are you going to do when you retire? I can tell you, but I can tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to grade written exams anymore. I'm really looking forward to not doing that. But maybe we ought to have the live voice exam in our time. An advantage for faculty members, if faculty members are afraid of it, is, once the exam is over, the candidate goes out for 10 minutes. You all discuss it, and they walk back in, and you say, Mr. Yun, we've decided that we're going to give you the grade B+ for this exam. Congratulations, and so forth. And it's done. You don't have to do anything beyond that. It's all done. We face new challenges. John Wesley opened his soul to be formed by God, by the ancient scriptures and their old languages, to be formed by the writers of the early Christian church. You and I have talked about that. By the beautiful liturgies of his own church, day after day, year after year, to be formed by the present power of the Holy Spirit at Aldersgate and throughout his life. We face new challenges in theological education. We don't have all the answers. Korea is now becoming a hub for the development of Asian and Pacific forms of theological education. I can see that very clearly. That's why I was here in 2012. The United Methodist Church was saying, sorry, but we're not going to be able to support being the hub for theological education in the Asian and the Pacific, and we started a new organization. But Korea is now becoming sort of what the United States was in being the center point for theological formation throughout the world. That's a new challenge. I'm on the board of the Moscow Theological Seminary. Now, it's a United Methodist institution, but all of those Eurasian Methodist conferences are probably going to separate from us, and they will probably align themselves more with Korea. So all the more reason why you'll need to be seeing that big change coming. John Wesley didn't just sit still. He didn't just act. He did both of these things. He studied hard, he meditated, he wrote, he tested ideas with friends, then he boldly stepped out to act in new ways, but ways in which his study and prayer and meditation and conversations had prepared him. He stepped out, he broke the molds, he found new ways of sharing the gospel and forming people in the faith. So I've got a request. I ask you, all of you, in the name of Christ, to do likewise, to open yourself up to God by deep and continuous study and conversation every day, and then step out and act in Christ's name. Amen. Yeah.
제 주변에도 SNS를 1시간 단위로 올리는 아주 가까운 사람이 있는데 아마도 진정한 웨슬리의 후예였던 것 같습니다. 만약에 제가 테드 캠벨 교수님을 진작에 알았더라면 웨슬리에 대한 공부를 좀 더 깊게 하지 않았을까라는 생각도 가져보게 되었습니다. 귀한 강의였고 또한 특별히 신학교육, 미래 세대를 위한 신학교육을 고민하고 있는 우리 감리교신학대학교에는 더 많은 질문을 어떻게 웨슬리의 후예들이 웨슬리가 원하는 방향으로 또한 하나님께서 기쁘게 사용하실 수 있는 목회 현장으로 보낼 수 있는 사역자들을 어떻게 교육시켜야 하는지에 대한 귀한 질문을 우리들에게 던져주셨다라는 생각을 또한 더불어 품게 됩니다. 매일 기도하고 연구하고 또한 그를 적극적으로 우리의 삶에서 구현하기 위해서 수고하는 우리들이 되어야 되겠다는 생각도 함께 해보게 되었습니다. 이제 이 강의에 대해서 우리 학교의 기독교 영성 교수님으로 가르치고 연구하시는 남기정 교수님께서 응답해 주시겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 남기정입니다. 교수님의 강의 잘 들었고요. 또 제가 미리 이것을 가지고 논찬을 위해서 글을 써봤습니다. 그거 참고해 주시고요. 교수님께는 영어로 된 걸 미리 드렸습니다. 제가 쓴 논찬문을 중심으로 리스폰스 해보도록 하겠습니다. 캠벨 교수님은 웨슬리 생애 속에 있는 한 장면이 챗 GPT와 같은 오늘날 AI 기술이 가져올 새로운 변화 속에서 교회를 이끌어가야 할 우리 미래 세대의 지도자들을 훈련하는데 큰 도움이 되는 통찰을 제공하고 있다고 단언하고 계십니다. 그 한 장면은 다른 것 아니라 우리 초기 감리교 부흥에서 아주 중요한 전기가 되었던 1739년 4월 2일 월요일입니다. 이날 웨슬리는 처음으로 야외 설교를 감행했습니다. 캠벨 교수님은 다양한 자료들을 효과적으로 활용해서 이날 하루 웨슬리의 일정을 재구성하고 보여주면서 웨슬리의 영적 면모를 우리들에게 보여주고 계십니다. 그날 웨슬리는 한마디로 기존의 관례들은 더 이상 통용되지 않는 현실, 하지만 새로운 규칙은 아직 확립되지 않은 그 불확실한 상황 속에서 기도 그리고 동료들과의 영적 대화를 통해서 하나님의 뜻을 분별하고 그것에 따라 자신이 해야 할 일을 결정하고 행동으로 옮긴 모습을 보여주십니다. 그날 웨슬리는 그때까지 한 번도 가지 않았던 길로 나갔습니다. 그 길은 심지어 그의 교회, 영국 교회가 아직 준비하지 못하고 있었던 길이었습니다. 그런 상황에서 그는 개인적인 경건 실천 그리고 신실한 사람들과의 영적 대화를 통해 자신을 향한 하나님의 부르심을 확인하고 그 부르심에 따라 기존의 틀을 깨고 앞으로 나갔습니다. 그것은 그의 순회 설교자로서의 삶의 시작이었습니다. 이 결단은 말할 것도 없이 이후 감리교 운동 발전에 아주 심대한 영향을 미쳤습니다. 중요한 것은 그가 어떻게 이런 결단에 이르는 신앙이 되었을까 하는 점입니다. 이 점이 중요합니다. 이러한 웨슬리의 모습은 오늘날 새로운 길을 준비해야 하는 오늘날의 그리스도인들에게도 분명 귀중한 귀감이 될 것입니다. 캠벨 교수님은 이 점에 대해서 이 강연에서 세 가지를 말씀하고 계십니다. 첫째, 웨슬리에게는 지적 연구뿐만이 아니라 묵상과 찬송 부르기가 함께 있는 개인 경건 생활이 있었습니다. 여기서 묵상은 하나님의 말씀을 늘 암송하고 기억하는 기독교적인 묵상을 포함합니다. 웨슬리는 이러한 경건 실천을 통해서 깨달음과 함께 그것에 합당한 열망을 가지는 지성과 영성이 함께 있는 신앙을 형성했습니다. 그리고 무엇보다 이 시간은 웨슬리에게 다른 그 무엇보다도 하나님의 음성에 귀를 기울이는 시간을 제공해 주었습니다. 두 번째로 웨슬리는 그날 있었던 일을 기록하는 개인 일기, 다이어리입니다. 오늘 교수님께서 다이어리하고 저널의 차이를 지속적으로 말씀하셨는데요. 그것을 우리말로 잘 구분이 안 가서 다이어리는 개인 일기라고 해봤습니다. 이것은 있었던 일을 있는 그대로 빠르게 적는 것을 말합니다. 그리고 이것을 바탕으로 어느 정도 시간이 지나서 본격적인 형식을 갖춘 저널을 쓰는 일을 해왔습니다. 웨슬리는 이 두 가지 글쓰기를 지속적으로 실천했습니다. 그는 이 두 가지 글쓰기를 진행하면서 자신의 삶 속에서 일어나는 일들을 성찰할 수 있었고 그 속에 깃든 하나님의 뜻을 깊이 음미할 수 있었습니다. 세 번째로는 친밀한 사람들과의 영적 대화를 나누는 소그룹 활동이 있었습니다. 그 속에서 웨슬리는 자기중심성을 넘어서서 자신에게 일어나는 일들을 분별할 수 있는 시간을 가질 수 있었고 순수한 의도로 하나님의 뜻을 따라 행동할 수 있었습니다. 우리가 잘 아는 웨슬리의 대중 속에서의 행동들은 바로 이러한 내적이고 성찰적인 활동에 의해 뒷받침되고 있었던 것입니다. 이것이 웨슬리가 틀을 깨고 한 번도 가보지 않은 길을 가는 결단을 할 수 있었던 영적 비결입니다. 그러므로 웨슬리의 이러한 조용한 실천들, 즉 개인기도, 글쓰기, 소그룹 이런 것들을 오늘날 신학생들의 영성 형성에 반영하면 큰 도움이 될 것입니다. 여기까지가 제가 이해한 캠벨 교수님의 제안입니다. 그런데 제가 보기에는 이러한 캠벨 교수님의 제안 속에는 세 가지 함의가 들어 있습니다. 먼저 이 주장은 신학교육이 단지 지식을 전수하는 것만으로 완성되지 않는다는 아주 근본적인 사실을 분명하게 부각하고 있습니다. 우리는 바로 이 지점에서 챗GPT의 역할, 기여, 그리고 그것의 한계를 가늠하는 일을 시작할 수 있을 것입니다. 또한 이 기술이 가져올 세상의 변화에 대해서 신학적으로 대처하는 일을 시작할 수 있을 것입니다. 두 번째로 웨슬리가 보여주는 세 가지 조용한 실천들은 그리스도의 제자도, 즉 기독교 영성의 중요한 특성이 관상과 실천의 조화라는 사실을 확인해 주고 있습니다. 사실 4월 2일 하루 웨슬리의 삶은 이러한 기독교 영성 안에 있는 조화를 자기 상황 속에서 구현한 것이었습니다. 마가복음 1장 35절 이하에 보면 바쁜 공생의 가운데 또 기도하시는 그리스도의 모습이 보도되어 있습니다. 새벽 아직도 밝기 전에 예수께서 일어나 나가 한적한 곳에 가사 거기서 기도하시더니, 그렇습니다. 그리스도께서는 바쁜 공생의 일상 속에서도 하늘아버지, 즉 자신을 그곳에 보내신 분과의 소통하는 시간을 결코 잊지 않으셨습니다. 그리고 이 시간을 통해서 수많은 요구들 가운데에서 하나님의 뜻을 확인하고 그것을 중심으로 자신의 길을 일관되게 가셨습니다. 모든 사람이 주를 찾나이다 라는 베드로의 말에 주님이 주신 대답, 우리가 다른 가까운 마을로 가자. 거기서도 전도하리니 내가 이를 위하여 왔노라. 이 말씀은 그분의 관상과 실천의 조화, 그리고 그것에서 비롯된 분별을 잘 보여줍니다. 캠벨 교수님께서 제안하시는 웨슬리의 조용한 실천들은 바로 이렇게 그리스도에게서 비롯된 관상과 실행의 조화라는 특징을 가진 기독교 영성을 웨슬리가 자기 삶의 자리에서 충실히 구현한 것입니다. 웨슬리는 이러한 삶을 통해 그날의 결단을 내릴 수 있었던 것입니다. 세 번째로, 이러한 관상과 행동의 조화는 변혁의 시기에 새로운 신앙의 길을 열어야 했던 그리스도인들의 모습에서 많이 발견됩니다. 웨슬리의 내적 성찰적 생활과 대중 속에서 실천의 모습에 대한 캠벨 교수님의 설명을 읽어가는 동안 저는 보네퍼 목사님이 쓰신 신도의 공동생활에 수록된 구절들을 떠올리게 되었습니다. 홀로 있을 수 없는 사람은 사귐 앞에서 마음의 고삐를 잡으라. 사귐 안에 있지 않은 사람은 고독 앞에서 마음의 고삐를 잡으라. 이와 같이 보네퍼 목사님의 삶에서도 관상과 실천의 조화가 강조됩니다. 보네퍼는 인간의 진보에 대한 희망, 인간 이성에 대한 기대가 처참하게 허물어지는 것을 지켜보는 야만의 시대를 살았습니다. 그도 그런 속에서 복음을 공유할 새로운 길을 모색해야 했습니다. 이런 상황에서 보네퍼 목사님은 웨슬리가 그랬듯 내적이고 성찰적인 개인 경건 생활, 그리고 공동체의 사귐을 통해 대중 속에서 해야 할 일들에 대해 분별했고 그것을 실행했습니다. 이런 삶을 통해 수많은 소리들 가운데 하나님의 음성을 분별하고 그것에 따라 앞으로 나아갈 수 있었습니다. 이러한 점을 감안하면서 생각해 볼 때 챗 GPT로 대별되는 새로운 물결 속에서 교회를 이끌어가야 하는 크리스찬 리더들을 위해 리더들을 위한 신학교육의 관상과 실천의 조화를 소개하고 그것을 갖추기 위한 훈련을 도입해야 한다는 캠벨 교수님의 주장은 매우 타당하다고 볼 수 있습니다. 아울러 캠벨 교수님이 이러한 주장의 타당성을 이끌어내고 제시하는 방식이 매우 인상적이어서 언급하고 싶습니다. 캠벨 교수님은 다양한 역사 자료들의 장르와 성격, 그 글의 의도를 정확하게 파악하고 이것들을 감안하면서 자료들을 종합하고 재구성했습니다. 이러한 작업은 높은 완성도를 가져왔고 거기에 반영된 교수님의 탁월한 관점까지 더해져서 독자들에게 그리고 청중들에게 웨슬리 영성, 즉 그의 관상과 실행의 조화의 특성을 아주 생생하게 잘 보여주고 있습니다. 그리고 그 의미를 분명하게 이해할 수 있도록 제시해 주고 계십니다. 무엇보다 이러한 작업은 웨슬리 영성 연구에 좋은 선례가 된다고 생각합니다. 이제 우리가 생각해야 할 것은 현재 한국의 상황을 잘 파악해서 우리 상황 속에서 어떻게 이런 관상과 실천의 조화를 가진 기독교의 영성을 구현할 것인가? 이런 일을 위해 웨슬리의 선례와 제안들을 어떻게 효과적으로 활용할 것인가와 같은 질문에 대답하기 위해 노력해야 한다는 것일 것입니다. 끝으로.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
끝으로 이와 관련해서 캠벨 교수님께 제가 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 우리 시대는 AI와 정보혁명이 대두되는 시기인 동시에 모더니티에서 포스트 모더니티로 변천이 진행되고 있는 시기입니다. 반면에 웨슬리의 시대는 이성의 잠재력이 강조되던 계몽의 시대였습니다. 그리고 산업혁명의 시대였습니다. 영적 삶에 관한 웨슬리의 선례들과 제안들을 우리들의 신앙 형성에 반영하는 일에 이러한 차이를 어떻게 다뤄야 할지를 묻고 싶습니다.
감사합니다. Thank you very much. Yeah. Very, very thoughtful response. And so I'm going to respond to you briefly and then let you go paragraph by paragraph and try to translate this. Well, first of all, I appreciate your gracious reception of the paper that I wrote and your deep thoughts on this. In particular, your way of relating this to Jesus' own spirituality, how Jesus prayed by himself. He went off into the desert to pray and so on and so forth. I think that's really, really important to remember. We need to change locations, right, to get a new perspective. You can't just sit there in the same place and do it. And I think having a location for prayer is something that Jesus and all the saints have really told us. This is how you do it. The desert fathers and mothers used to say, how will I learn about the spiritual life? And the answer one of the wise teachers gave was, your cell will teach you everything. This one place that you are sort of limited in sensory input and so forth, that place is going to be basically where God will teach you what you need to know about the spiritual life. Secondly, I appreciate the reference to Bonhoeffer. I simply must read Life Together. I've been hearing it all my life. When I had a conversion experience when I was 17 years old, it was 1970. I went to my church camp that summer, and there I heard everybody talking about Bonhoeffer, and I bought The Cost of Discipleship, and I took it home. I read this cool book, and I found it really, really difficult. I still have my copy marked up, like, what does this mean, and so forth, and underlining stuff as if I really understood it, and I know that I didn't, but it took me a year to go through it, but it's very rich, very deep. I learned later that year, 1970, was the 25th anniversary of his execution in May of 1945. So we were right at that. I'm certain that's why all the attention was being paid there. But you've just made me determined to go back. I ordered during COVID some new translations of the Bonhoeffer stuff, and they've been sitting on my desk. So thank you. I'm going to go read Life Together. I need to do that. That's what God is calling me to do through you, of all people. Now, the question. Yes, you're quite right to say Wesley lives at a nodal point in the development of technology and society. He lives right at that nodal point, moving from an agrarian society to a mercantile society to an industrial society. And I mean, it's just happening right at the time when the Methodist movement gets started, because two men in the county of Devon in England invented more efficient water pumps. And that may not sound like something that would change the world, but Britain is an island. And when you dig a hole in the ground, it fills up with water, unless you've got a really efficient pump that can get water out. But once Thomas Savery and Thomas Newcomen developed these ways of pumping water, they could dig deep shafts, and it's completely changing the look of England. It's becoming, coal mining is becoming impossible on a huge scale. And if you put blue marks in the places in England on a map where John Wesley and George Whitefield preached, and then you put red marks, red pins on the map at the points where there were new industrial settlements and new industrial cities like Newcastle upon Tyne, it's almost a one-to-one correspondence. There's no doubt he's responding very directly to that. Now, how do we respond? Well, the way I would think about this is different people are going to have different gifts for how to respond. There's always an inclination to say, let's have a committee meeting, and our committee will decide how the church responds to the issue of ChatGPT or AI and so on and so forth. What that seems to ignore is the fact that there are just extraordinary women and men who are already probably developing ideas. And I think part of what we need to do is to go out and look for that sort of thing. But I'll tell you what keeps coming to my mind in terms of a spirituality in a technological age, an information age. It's the word Shabbat. It's the word Sabbath. I knew a kind of Sabbath when I was growing up as a Methodist, and it was a Methodist thing. We polished our shoes on Saturday night to get ready for church. Sunday morning, we went to Sunday school at 9:45, and we went to church at 11 a.m. And then after that, we went to our grandparents' houses. They lived down the street from each other, and we played with my cousins. And then at a certain time in the evening, the older kids went to the Methodist youth meeting, and then a little while later, we went to the Sunday evening service where we sang from the Cokesbury Worship Hymnal and all those old gospel songs, and then we went home and watched television for a little while. But it was a very different day than other days, and I kind of long for that. But my question is that just my generation longing for that, or do other people younger than me long for a time when there's just a day of quiet? I lived in a strongly Jewish area of Chicago. Skokie is the town where I was. Lots of synagogues, lots of people. A friend of mine was a nurse, and she said how many people that had numbers tattooed on their arms, meaning they had been victims of Nazi propagation, Nazi harassment, and luckily they survived, but that was a sign of that. But you know, what we saw was that on Friday evenings and Saturdays through the day, people were out in the parks with their kids. They're walking to the shul, to the synagogue. They're enjoying this day. And it occurred to me, maybe this is the best gift God has for the modern information age. A day when you just pull back and take it easy. Said way too much there. You get one or two of those things?
예.
I was supposed to stop at every paragraph. Good luck.
예. 처음에는 패러그래프별로 하기로 교수님하고 약속을 했는데 예.
Yeah, I know what he said.
아시다시피 예, 그렇습니다. 제가 정리한 대로 잠깐 말씀드리면 처음에는 우선 제가 잘 읽어주고 그리고 이 교수님의 글을 예수님의 영성과 연결해서 설명해 준 것을 감사하다는 말씀을 하셨고요. 그리고 보네퍼 목사님의 신도의 공동생활과 연결해 준 것에 감사하다는 말씀을 하셨고요. 그 다음에 제가 질문한 요즘 우리 시대와 웨슬리 시대의 차이를 어떻게 극복할까요? 해서 하신 말씀은 가장 중요하게는 그런 기술과 정보 이런 것의 차이 모든 것이 다 있지만 우리가 사바스 안식일을 지키는 일 혹은 우리가 가지고 있는 모든 것으로부터 잠시 떠나 있는 시간을 가져보는 것이 가장 이러한 웨슬리 그리고 예수님의 우리 기독교 영성을 받아들이는데 가장 중요한 것이 아니겠는가 하는 말씀을 하셨습니다. 네.
네, 수고해 주신 두 분께 먼저 박수부터 드리도록 하겠습니다. 이제 여러분들의 질문을 우리 교수님께 전달해 드리겠습니다. This is a very personal question, I guess.
Okay.
How do you practice the Wesleyan life in your daily life?
Okay.
And how you ever been struggling with practice them?
Yes.
If so, how did you overcome it?
Okay. That's a great question. And that's just the kind of question you ought to ask people like me. That's exactly the right kind of
Please allow me
question.
to translate in Korean,
Yeah,
please.
okay. Yeah.
질문이 굉장히 좀 좋다고 하셨는데 학생의 질문인지는 정확히 모르겠습니다만은 어떻게 일상의 삶 속에서 웨슬리안으로서의 프랙티스를 하시는지 여쭈었고 그걸 할 때 어려움이 있지 않느냐 그러니까 그 어려움을 어떻게 극복하셨는가라고 하는 아주 구체적인 질문을 올려드렸습니다.
Yes. All right. I constantly fail at this, but the great thing is God has given me a great gift, and that's my wife, who is far better Methodist than I am. Okay? And she kind of holds me to this. It's interesting. But I also, my wife and I had an experience together in the 1980s when we were at Perkins School of Theology. And at that point, brilliant scholar and leader named David Lowes Watson was there. David Lowes Watson wrote the book on the class meeting, and he was very strict in how he interpreted it. It wasn't a Bible study. It wasn't a prayer meeting. It wasn't chit-chat. It was, you make a covenant with each other. You agree for 3 months, for a semester. Our little group is going to keep that covenant. And it was a transformative experience. I really have had nothing like that. And it held us to prayer every day. It held us to working in the soup kitchen or trying to find ways to make Dallas better. Some of those kinds of things. So that's part of it. I may continue, but why don't you translate that?
좋은 질문이셨고 실제 이 웨슬리의 영성을 삶 속에서 수행하는 데 있어서는 실질적으로 우리 교수님의 아내분이 큰 도움을 주셨다라고 하시면서 신학교 시절로 돌아가서 80년대에 그 시절에 SMU 퍼킨스 신학교에서 데이비드 왓슨 교수님의 수업을 통해서 특별히 다음과 같은 과제를 주셨다는 겁니다. 그 학기 기간 동안 언약을 맺고 그 맺은 언약을 성실히 수행하고 어떻게 그 맺은 언약들을 말씀을 읽고 기도를 하는 일종의 영성 생활들을 어떻게 수행하는지에 대한 서로가 그 나눔의 시간이 이런 웨슬리의 경건 훈련을 하는 데 있어서요 어떤 시발점이 되었던 것으로 이해할 수 있습니다.
One further thing I would just mention, part of my formation was, Don, since you're a liturgiologist, I found a Lutheran LCMS, a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod daily prayer book from the 60s or early 70s, and it was beautifully produced. You may know this book, yeah. And it was completely outdated within a few years by the new lectionaries that came out. But I was taken with that. I developed a daily office for my little Methodist congregation in Houston. Methodists had that at the beginning, but in 1792 in the United States, we put almost all of the prayer book services in our little book of discipline, which was a very bright thing to do, except we left out the lectionary and we left out the services for daily morning and evening prayer that John Wesley had said. So we've been trying to restore those practices, and that's been part of my life. I can show you, I can send Ihu Jung a copy of the form of daily morning and evening prayer I use. I call it sometimes ADHD daily prayer, because I am ADHD and it's a challenge to keep attention, but this one is short and snappy and does cool stuff, like it starts with something you mentioned, the great commandment, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That's Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And that's a Wesleyan thing to keep in mind. Anyway, that's part of how I struggle with that.
이 젊은 시절부터 교수님은 이 예식서에 근거한 기도 훈련을 일상의 삶에서 구현하기 위한 수고와 노력을 마다하지 않으셨습니다. 특별히 그 시작은 비록 웨슬리가 미국 감리교를 위해서 예식서를 전해 줬지만 미국 교회가 웨슬리 사후에 이것을 예식서를 줄이고 기도서를 줄이고 교리와 장정이라고 하는 책자 안에 예문이라고 하는 것을 삽입해서 기도 전통을 상당히 축소시킨 것은 참 아쉽기도 하고, 이후에 예식서가 공식적으로 교단을 통해서 출판되었지만 저는 루터란 미주리 시노드에서 나왔던 예식서가 있었고 예배서가 있었고, 그 예배서에 나와 있던 좋은 기도글들이 매일의 영성 훈련을 하는 데 있어서 큰 디딤돌 역할을 해줬습니다. 뿐만 아니라 저는 이와 같이 매일 드리는 기도문들, 교단에 나온 예식서라든지 또 이런 매일의 삶 속에서 반복적으로 읽는 기도글들을 통해서 저의 개인적인 영성 훈련을 지속해 나가고 있습니다.
Thank you.
There are many questions regarding diary and the journal.
Yes.
Because in Korean term, as the doctor mentioned,
Yeah.
we don't have differentiate
Yeah.
The specific term,
Yeah.
journal and diary.
Well, yeah.
질문 가운데 몇 분이 그 저널하고 다이어리가 어떻게 다른지 그 질문이 여러 분이 해주셨기 때문에 제가 모아서 그냥 일반적인 질문을 다시 한번 드렸습니다.
Good. Okay, so in the past, most people have confused the journal and the diary. That's the big problem. And in fact, in the past, we really didn't have most of the diary. All we had was the journal, and as still 40 years of the diary is missing. But just in the last 20 to 25 years have we got the complete journal and diary together. That Dick Heitzen-Rader and what's the British scholar who worked on this together, but they completed the whole journal and diary. And the diary is kind of in the footnotes, but the journal is the main text, and there you can see it. I just think it's a very different thing. What you need to do every day is just that really quick. Here's what I did, so you can go back and remember. Otherwise, Ihu Jung, what I have to do is go back and look at my old photos to decide, was I in Korea in 2003 or 2005? And it turns out I was wrong. It was 2005. Or 2008 or 2012. It was 2012. I can go back in my photos and look. That takes a lot of time, though. But they're very different things. The diary is just what you write down. The journal is what you meditate on. It's what do you find significant? When you look back 2 years ago, what were you going through then? I mean, think about it. It was COVID. It was the end of COVID, maybe, but what was happening? Now you have a little more perspective to think about that.
뭐 아까 강의 속에서도 말씀을 하셨지만 한 20여 년 전만 해도 다이어리하고 저널에 큰 차이점을 사람들이 두지는 않았지만 그리고 아쉽게도 다이어리 40년째 다이어리가 현재 전소돼서 찾을 수는 없지만 실제 이 두 영역의 가장 큰 차이점은 저널은 메인이라고 보면 되고 다이어리라고 하는 것은 풋노트의 성격으로 이해할 수도 있을 것 같다라고 하시면서 저널은 이렇게 묵상을 하는 것 또한 의미를 파악하는 것에 대한 기록들이라고 한다면 다이어리는 그것에 대한 좀 세부적인 사항들로 이해하시면 될 것으로 설명을 해 주셨습니다. In more specific way of a question is that there is any document that describe or differentiate these two areas?
Yes, I would say the best thing is that in the introduction to Dick Heitzenrater and this British, it's Reginald Ward, okay, Reginald Ward and Richard P. Heitzenrater, in the introduction to the first volume of the journals, published volume of the journals, they have an introductory essay that introduces that. I have an article called Journaling and Diary Keeping, but it's more about not just John Wesley, but the later Methodists who continued to follow that pattern.
존 웨슬리의 그 저널 그 앞에 인트로덕션 부분에 이 차이를 분명하게 밝히고 있다라고 합니다. 이 질문하신 분은 좀 참고를 해주시면 될 것 같고 차후에 교수님께 또 오셔서 여쭤보셔도 될 것이라 생각이 듭니다. In these days, so many Korean Christians are interested in writing a spiritual journal.
Yes.
My question is that what is the difference between diary and spiritual journal in Christian spiritual life or formation?
I can guess an answer to that. You might be able to help with this too, but yeah, always recruit someone else. But one thing is, you actually need to have in your diary, I think you need to have everything together. What meetings did you have? Where did you go? Whether it's spiritual or not. And then I would say, what I have in mind for describing the journal is more like the spiritual kind of interpretation where you're thinking about what was God doing during this time. I mean, I can tell you, for example, what's been happening in the last few years of my life. Well, we've been going through this division in the United Methodist Church. Now, some people say, I have had a prophetic sense and not a happy one. I've been kind of like, you know the difference between Isaiah and Jeremiah? Isaiah is always, trust in God. It's going to be good. God's going to deliver Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is, you're dead meat. You know, God is going to ruin this place. And that's a bad job. You don't want that. That's kind of what I've been saying. But as it's come to pass, as the division is now happening, and frankly, mostly happened now, we're pretty much through it, I feel more confident. I can kind of see where the future is going, and it's challenging, but that's part of it. Does that make sense? Or does it answer that question? Maybe not.
I mean, what I felt from his question is more, he's asking more practical way of how the church members can accept or...
Well, I think what I would encourage is just keep a diary every day, and you can look back at, like if you use the Windows, if you use the Apple calendar app, you can just go back through and you can do a week at a time, really, of diary. You just go through, this is what I find if I go further than a week or so, I can't remember what I did back then. But you've at least got this outline in your calendar, And then you can look at photos that you've taken, and that's very helpful for me to tell. So that's the diary side of it. I think the journaling side, the more spiritual side of it, is to sort of go for a walk and think about this, and where are you being challenged, and what is God asking you to do? How about it? You got it.
제가 좀 도와드리도록 하겠습니다.
Will you teach spiritual formation?
우리말에도 일지하고 일기 구별이 있긴 있지요. 그런데 우리가 그걸 잘 구별해서질 않은데 일기는 매일매일 있었던 일을 그냥 잊기 전에 써놓는 일을 말합니다. 그리고 난 다음에 저널은 그것에 대해서 깊이 돌아보면서 반추하고 성찰한 다음에 그 표면의 의미보다 더 깊은 의미를 깨달은 것을 가지고 쓰는 일을 말합니다. 그래서 그것은 통상 얼른 생각나는 예는 그 인사이드 아웃에 보면은 그 소녀가 처음에 경험하고 몇 년 지난 다음에 경험이 같은 경험인데 다른 걸 느끼잖아요. 그리고 그 경험을 찾은 다음에 삶이 변하잖아요. 그런 차이를 가지는 일을 말합니다. 처음에 다이어리는 있었던 일 표면이라면 그것이 좀 지나고 난 다음에 그것에 대해 깊이 성찰하면서 거기에 깃들였던 하나님의 뜻과 의미, 하나님의 터치 같은 것을 느끼고 그것을 포함해서 숙성해서 나온 기록, 이렇게 보시면 되겠습니다. 그리고 웨슬리는 저널은 출판을 목적으로 썼습니다. 형식을 갖추어서. 그렇지만 다이어리는 암호로 자기만 알아볼 수 있도록 썼습니다. 그래서 그걸 가지고 이런 성찰의 기록, 영적 성찰의 기록을 써서 출판했다는 것. 그 둘을 말하는 것이고, 캠벨 교수님은 그 두 가지 글을 같이 하면서 우리 삶을 성찰하는 것이 굉장히 중요하다고 말씀하고 계시는 것입니다.
Give me the quick.
Yeah, I explained what. Oh, actually.
That's the main. Yes, thank you.
단셀리우스 교수님 강의에 비해서 학생들이 이제 뭐 수업 관련해서 여러 가지 이유로 해서 자리를 먼저 좀 떴는데 지금 테드 캠벨 교수님께서 추천해 주시는 구두 시험으로 시험을 보라고 하신 제안이 학생들한테는 굉장히 좀 긴장되는 영역이 아닐까라는 생각이 들고, 저도 지금 말씀을 들으면서 파이널 시험을 그 구두 시험으로 봐야 되겠다라는 마음의 생각을 갖게는 됐습니다. 저에게는 지혜였지만 학생들에게는 좀 어려움이 아닐까라는 생각도 좀 가져보게 됐습니다. 마지막 질문 하나를 드리고 오늘 전체 강의를 좀 마쳐볼까 합니다. Here is the last question for you tonight. Your account sounds similar with the back to the basic or classic. But as all of us know, the world at the moment and in the near future is and will be still more like full of, part of fast pace, confusion, and quick misleading. If we follow your suggestion, it'll be a little lonely fight or journey. Would you give us a word of encouragement?
Yes. Let me encourage you. That's one word or two. Okay. Yes, I think that's right. There's no slowing down the machine now. Actually, if you think about it, COVID slowed us down, didn't it? I mean, at least if your experience in Korea was like the United States, the first few weeks, I have to say, there was a sense in which it was wonderful. It was just, my wife and I were at our home. We were not going out. We were not doing stuff. And it was just this marvelous time to be together. And I started thinking, I'm going to retire. I like this. I really, and so there was a good side to it. So I'm not sure you can say it's always going to be like that. But yes, in general, I think the observation is really sound that there's no slowing the pace. So how do we find the space within that fast-paced world for what I'm calling Shabbat and Shalom that go together so very well? For where do you find that quiet space? I'm convinced, because I've tried this, that you can't do it by yourself. You can't just decide, well, I'm going to spend the day by myself. I do that every now and then, but I'll give you an example. When I was president at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, I told my staff, okay, I had seen the Jews in Skokie practicing Shabbat, and I said, it's just lovely. I want to do this. So I'm going to tell my staff, I'm not going to travel on Sunday, and I'm going to request churches, if they invite me, not to take me out to eat on Sundays. And so you know what happened? You can almost guess. Go ahead and translate that if you want to. But what happened was, when we told that, the church women prepared a big meal, and they did not observe Shabbat because they were having to work to do that. See, so unless you have a whole community that somehow agrees to do this, like a Jewish community, I think it's very hard to do on your own. But I want it. I'm just saying, I want that sense of space and time and quiet and.
질문 자체는 뭐냐 하면 어떻게 이 분주하고 빠른 세상 가운데 지금 교수님께서 말씀해 주신 그리스도인으로서의 정체성을 잘 지키면서 신앙훈련을 해가면서 그렇게 살 수 있겠는가, 이 어려운 세상에 어떻게 견뎌내면서 살 수 있을지 좀 좋은 용기가 될 만한 덕담을 해 주십사 질문을 드렸고, 그거에 대해서 충분히 감당할 수 있다, 그렇게 살아갈 수 있다, 그리고 특히 신앙의 이름으로 넉넉히 이겨낼 수 있다, 그러면서 교수님의 개인 경험을 잠깐 나눠주셨어요. 본인께서는 이 안식이 가지고 있는 안식일의 의미를 한번 되짚어 주시면서 실제 본인께서 주일날 초대받아서 말씀을 전하거나 뭐 이런 경우가 있을 때 같이 외부에 나가서 식사하거나 이런 것들을 최대한 자제하고 금하는데, 유대인 공동체에서 교수님을 모셔서 말씀을 듣는 시간에 음식을 교회에서 준비를 해서 섬겨주셨다라는 거예요. 유대인들 전통 속에서는 안식일을 거룩하게 지키기 때문에 음식을 만드는 것 자체가 그들에게 있어서 율법을 넘어서야만 있는 일이지만, 그 공동체성을 위해서 모두가 수고하고 노력하는 그런 모습을 본인이 보았노라라고 하시면서 실제 믿음으로 신앙으로 이것들을 감당해 나가면 그런 훈련을 통해서 지금 말씀하시는 이 웨슬리의 영성이 우리 안에 있지 않겠느냐, 광의적으로 해석을 해 주시는 것 같습니다. 저희들이 준비한 오늘의 시간은 여기까지인데, 원래 오늘 순서를 다 마감해 주시기 위해서 그 축도를 해 주셔야 할 분이 계셨습니다. 그런데 불가피한 일이 교회에 있으셔서 자리를 비우셨고, 제가 특별히 지금 이건 사전에 약속된 거는 아니지만 아마 우리 모든 분들 다수의 여러분들이 미국 목사님들은 어떻게 축도를 하시는지 아마 못 들어보셨을 겁니다. 그리고 지금 우리 단셀리우스 교수님은 이제 생애 마지막 이 저서를 집필 중에 계세요. 시편을 가지고 오늘 말씀 가운데서도 시편 말씀을 여러 차례 언급하셨지만, 시편을 예배학적으로 신학적으로 우리가 어떻게 경험할 것인가를 마지막 저서로 집필 중에 계시는데, 한국 교회를 위해서 또 우리 감리교신학대학교를 위해서 우리 단셀리우스 교수님께 미국식 축도를 한번 요청해 보는 것이 어떨까 싶습니다. 미국 분들한테는 이런 모임의 축도로 모든 것을 맞추는 것이 익숙치는 않으실 거예요. 하지만 우리는 또 축도에 익숙해 있는 회중성이 있어서 Would you please lead us benediction as a closing the conference, please?
Don,
please. Yes.
Answer amen to me. Amen. Now may the God who created all things and called them good graciously bless us and smile upon us. And may Jesus Christ, who is our feast and our life and our way, smile upon us with his shalom. And may the Holy Spirit God's fire in our bones, God's breath in our life. Give us this and all of our days. Shalom, the peace of God. Amen. Hallelujah. Amen.
자, 이제 자유롭게 오셔서 사진 또 사인 받으시고 나가시면서는 준비되어 있는 간식 타임, 우리 신석구 목사 기념관 지하 2층에 간식 시간을 가지시면 되겠습니다.
Thank you very much. Those are great questions.
And it was a great lecture.